you don't need existential philosophy to get this. The songwriters and the poets have long taught us the same lesson. But I think that there's also a benefit in a society that functions with 140 characters or less, or reels that are less than 3 seconds long as their main mode of reflection. I think there's a benefit to wading in a little bit deeper to that trout stream and allowing some names like Sartre and Beauvoir and Kierkegaard and Plato and Aristotle to sort of emerge as also in our cloud of witnesses and our hiking partners.
I'm glad to have in the meeting house today a friend of mine, and in some sense a neighbor. He teaches at Furman University, just a few miles from my home. I met him just a half a mile from my home in an outdoor store, and he's been on the meeting house before when we talked about Christian nationalism, which I preached about just this past Sunday. Up at my little church in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Welcome back to the meeting house.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
And you're here because you've written a book.
I've written another book. This is the first book, though, I can recommend to people who do not speak Danish and have PhDs in philosophy.
Is that right?
So, yeah.
And there are not many of those people here tonight, are there?
Turns out. So, yeah, this book is called Camping with Kierkegaard, Faithfulness as a Way of Life. And it is an attempt to think about what life is all about and to figure out what is worthy of our purpose and our meaning, and to do so with a lot of stories about enjoying the mountains here in South Carolina and North Carolina.
Yes, I feel like I know your family. I was glad to see your wife and son come in because I've read about them in the book. I've read the book. I'm going to write a review this week and publish it in my newsletter. But I have some questions for you.
Yeah.
So if I were to go into a library, camping and Kierkegaard, this is the first time those two words have ever appeared together in the same sentence, don't you think?
I'm pretty sure it is, and it turns out it's hard to find two words that have never appeared together.
That's exactly right.
These might be a good pair.
This is why you are a PhD in philosophy, because you know how to do this, don't you?
That's true.
So I ask you, if I were to go into the library or a bookstore, in what department would I look for this book?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it would be in philosophy, but here's the problem. Nobody goes to the philosophy sections.
I understand that.
So my hope is that it would also show up in camping and outdoor activities and ethics and mountain biking, because it deals with all of that, trout fishing. And in fact, upon its release, it went #1 in the country in camping, mountain biking, ethics and morality, and philosophy and religious studies. So I was pretty proud to see it hit this wide variety. Yeah.
Well, I want to know, do you have a publicist, or is this all your campaign that you did?
I'm doing the best I can. My wife serves a pretty good role to spread the word. So.
Wow, and she's getting a cut of the proceeds, I'm sure.
Absolutely, that's right.
I want to know about that. Well, I have read the book, and you weave this literary fabric, as I write on my notes here, out of 4 places: home, classroom, sanctuary, and the mountains.
It's a good 4 places, right?
It's a good 4 places, the 4 places of your whole life right now, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 4 come together because I wrote the book very much as a result of my experiences through the pandemic, where our normal life got interrupted. It was impossible to stay moving forward in the inertia that had carried us forward, for years and years, in my case, decades. And when all of that broke down, asking the question, well, what's worth my time? What's worth my effort and my actions? And the answer seemed to be, well, shoot, I live near the mountains, and the only safe place to be is not around other humans. So come on, son and wife, let's head to the mountains. We camped, we fished, we hiked, backpacked. I got into mountain biking. And as a result, it allowed me to reflect on the basic question of philosophy, which is, what should we do with our lives? And the way I frame that is, what's worthy of our finitude?
What's worthy of our finitude? You said it's a very safe thing, but I read in the paper today that a woman from Greer, South Carolina, did you see this?
I don't know if I did.
Fell off a cliff just north of Black Mountain. Did you see this?
Oh my goodness, I did not. That's horrible.
They're having her funeral next week.
Oh my goodness. Well, here's the thing. So if we're going to think about finitude,
That's pretty finitude.
well,
isn't
it is. There are two aspects of the human condition that I think go into this, and one is our vulnerability, which obviously this story reveals, and the other is our relationality. And so we experience life and navigate the human condition as vulnerable beings, bodies that break down, hearts that can be broken, and also we only experience the world in relationship to others. And so trying to think about not only how should I spend my time, but with whom should I spend it is, I think, an absolutely central question of philosophy and also a central question for all of us wherever we find ourselves.
You know, you repeat that phrase a number of times about what should we do with our finitude. And then you highlight it, of course, in the final chapter. Very similar to, I want to say, a poem by Mary Oliver. You familiar with this poem? Tell me, what is your plan? What do you plan to do with this one wild and precious life? Have you heard this phrase?
I have not. That's wonderful.
Yes, and when I looked it up on Amazon, there's a whole series of books who have taken that title, inspired by the poet Mary Oliver. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire this kind of thinking.
I hope
and
so.
writing.
I mean, Kierkegaard is a 19th century Danish philosopher.
Good. Tell us about
who
Kierkegaard.
is often recognized as one of the founders of existentialism.
Oh, you'll have to explain that.
Well, the tricky thing is none of those words are necessary to understand the book. So the reason he's in the title is because I was trying to signal to readers this is a book that is philosophical. It is engaging in questions that are deep from Socrates all the way up to where we find ourselves today. But existentialism as a broad idea is just that in order to think well, we have to start by attending our lived practice. What is it we do? Why does it matter? Where are we trying to go? And so the other question that the book asks most centrally is to recognize that we are now who we are becoming. And so the question, do you like yourself? Are you okay with who you're becoming? Becomes another way of getting at what's worthy of my time and my joy here on earth. Am I actually putting in practice the habits, the behaviors, the relationships that are cultivating the kind of future that I hope to live into? And so that's ultimately what the book is about, which is existential philosophy, but we don't have to talk about the technical philosophy to get those ideas. And so this book tries from a variety of directions to invite people into those questions for themselves.
Yeah, I'll have to confess, it took me a little bit to get into those questions. But you found this, you testify in the book about how you got deeper into your mountain experience, that it was your engagement with these things that pushed you to the mountains and to the streams, because you talk about fishing a lot too. Talk to us about what happened to you, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, so I had spent my entire adult life focusing on what I understood to be being good at what I had chosen to do, being a good philosopher, a good professor, hoping to be a good husband, a good father. And yet, what the pandemic did is revealed to me that in some of these areas, I had allowed myself to get overcommitted to a certain type of output than being committed to the right kind of living. And this was highlighted to me years before the pandemic when my son, Atticus, was driving by Furman with my mother and father in the car, and he was probably 4 or 5, I guess, at the time, and he says, Grandma, look, there's Furman, that's where Dad lives.
Yes, I remember reading that in the book.
This is not a good thing,
No,
right?
it ain't a good thing.
And then a few years later, we were walking down the street here in Travelers Rest, and he was holding my hand, and he was probably 7 at the time, I guess, and he said, Dad, I've decided I don't want to be a philosopher. And of course, I did something, smarmy and was like, we're the coolest. To which he responded, again, without pretense or irony, because he was too young, I don't know, Dad, philosophers don't spend time with their kids. And so you'd think that would have changed things for me.
You would think.
No, because what I did with my life, what I thought was worthy of my finitude, I was working this hard for my son. I'm trying to get him a college fund. I'm trying to take care of the things that he needs. And then when COVID hit and it broke the ability to live in that justification, it positioned me as full-faced with, are you okay with who you are? And are you okay with this being true about you 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And I realized it was okay if I said no to a lot of other stuff and started saying yes to things that mattered more. And this doesn't mean that I'm not still grading my papers, writing books, teaching my classes. All of that happens. It's just that now that's not the focal point of how I get out of bed and move forward. I'm trying my best to find joy in a world marked by despair and encourage others to do the same relative to their activities they enjoy. I'm not suggesting everybody should go camping, but maybe they should find ways daily to enact that kind of intentional living, wherever they are.
And in your case, that turned out to be camping and biking and
Well, I
fishing.
got my PhD. My father was a professor, and my senior year in college, I went to the school where he taught. I think we fished like 80 days that year. And so I had always thought to myself, I should get a PhD and be a professor because you can fish all the time.
You get to fish.
I didn't understand that he already had tenure, that he had been doing this a long time. And so I had spent 20 years being a professor but not fishing very often. And so it was very easy when the pandemic hit and we couldn't be around others. It wasn't a hard question, well, where should we go? For me, it was, let's go to the mountains.
Let's go to the mountains. Yeah. And so you have found in your personal experience, this existential experience of being outdoors in the mountains. Other people find it in music.
Other places. Yeah.
Or art.
Well, and
or any kind of sport.
My wife would make very clear that she thinks sleeping on the ground is an absolutely ridiculous thing for humans to do.
That sounds like my wife too.
And she cannot understand why we aren't at a beachfront property. So it's not about the specifics, it's about these questions. Can we ask ourselves, am I doing today what's worthy of my finitude? Or as Anne Lamott says, are we where our feet are? Are we there on purpose? And if we're not, I'm trying to use existential philosophy, not in technical ways, but more in a religious sense as a cloud of witnesses, to invite us to realize that there's a whole bunch of people who have asked these questions, who have given us insight into the idea that we could do it differently. And that's, I think, the main point.
And of course, everybody finds that experience in a different slice of life.
Different place.
My wife is like yours. Her idea of going camping at the Holiday Inn.
Yes, that's right.
But some people find it in art forms, and some people in travel.
Travel, music. It even can be very, very simple. So the philosopher Kierkegaard says at one point, the knight of faith finds the sublime in the pedestrian. And so the idea of, as a theologian friend of mine says, her name's Wendy Farley, she says, maybe it's just lingering in the car to let the song finish before you get out and go into work.
I know.
Right? So it doesn't have to be this radical transformation of our practices. That's not available for a lot of people who are working 3 jobs just to try to get food on the table, for whom the idea of going camping sounds like a luxury that's just not possible. My suggestion is, well, how is it, though, that we can think about this approach to living, whatever our circumstances, so that, and this is the subtitle of the book, so that faithfulness becomes our value center rather than success. And this is not a suggestion that we shouldn't care about accomplishing things, but don't let those accomplishments define our meaning and our purpose.
Now, let me ask you, do you teach this in your classes at Furman?
I do. So one of the people who endorsed the book was a former student of mine. She's now at Princeton, and the way she endorsed it was said, I've always wanted to carry one of Simmons's classes with me that I could mark up and turn to when you need it. And so this book very much is, inculcated in the laboratory of the classroom. Before I ever had the inkling of writing this book, lots of the examples and the ideas were worked out in those spaces. And then when my life sort of flipped as a result of the pandemic and I started living what I had been teaching, I decided I needed to write a book that tried to invite others into that same space.
So in the book, you use the phrase, I think it was this phrase, Kierkegaard's turn toward nature.
Yeah.
So he had a conversion of sorts,
Sort of, yeah.
just like you did, but talk to me about Kierkegaard's experience with nature,
Yeah.
and how this maybe represents a wider spectrum of people.
Yeah, it certainly is not one of the better known parts of Kierkegaard. So I've had several Kierkegaardian scholars. Again, I was the president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society, which, as my wife will tell you, is not a thing that gets me free drinks when we go places. But some Kierkegaard scholars have reached out and actually said, oh, I wasn't aware of this aspect in Kierkegaard because it's a very minor thread.
It is a minor part.
But what happened is Kierkegaard was struggling to get writing done, and so he says, I can't write in the cities, this is in his journal, so I went on a journey. And what he does is goes on this journey basically to the Danish countryside, and as a result of these experiences, he does a lot of reflection on the lilies and the birds passages in the New Testament. And he talks about what we can learn from our teachers, the lilies and the birds. And the things that they have to teach us, he says, are three. We learn silence, we learn obedience, and we learn ultimately joy. And so the one that I'm interested in most pronouncedly in the book is the joy. What does it mean to learn joy in nature?
You also talk about the qualities of humility, hospitality, and gratitude. Where do these come from?
Those are drawn from a variety of sources. Some, and in the book I imagine younger folks and older folks will miss lots of these references because I have a plethora of 90s hip-hop gestures that...
It was over my head, every single one of them.
Believe me, all of my students think I'm, this old head and doesn't know anything new. So even from a contemporary rap artist named Kendrick Lamar, who has a song called Be Humble, the idea is humility goes all the way back, at least philosophically, to Socrates, who says you cannot seek truth if you think you've already found it. And so this idea of be humble so that you can look for what matters, be hospitable so you might learn from others what you've missed, and then show gratitude for the reality that that context where we can think and walk together is actually what defines our embodiment. We could have been jellyfish, which would have changed that very deeply. And the fact that we are able to walk and talk and bike and hike and fish is pretty cool. And so those three aspects become, for me, the three virtues that all of us, regardless of our religious perspective, our social views, our political commitments, those are really smart virtues to cultivate in our lives.
I'll have to confess I didn't get any of those musical references, but I did notice there was a glaring absence in the body of music.
There is no John Prine.
There's no John Prine. So
I admit, yes.
I have written in the margins of my copy the places where you need to, in the next edition,
John Prine. There we go.
John Prine lyrics that will illuminate this for the rest of us.
Now, I will say, for you John Prine fans, a singer-songwriter I draw on really heavily is Donovan Woods, who is a contemporary singer-songwriter, reminds me a lot of John Prine in certain ways. But he has a song called Next Year, where the whole point of the song is that his dad has always wanted to go see the Grand Canyon, but there was always stuff going on. They never made that trip. He and his friends had always wanted to, be able to go out and do these trips on their own and go to the woods. And then his son asks him one day, hey, when's next year? And he says, what do you mean, when's next year? And he says, well, you said next year we'll go camping, next year we'll go fishing, next year we'll get to do all these things. And then the chorus of the song is, there ain't no next year. And so the end of the song is, so we just packed up the car, I called in sick, and my dad and I drove to that Grand Canyon. And so the idea of that being this impetus, you don't need existential philosophy to get this. The songwriters and the poets have long taught us the same lesson. But I think that there's also a benefit in a society that functions with 140 characters or less, or reels that are less than 3 seconds long as their main mode of reflection. I think there's a benefit to wading in a little bit deeper to that trout stream and allowing some names like Sartre and Beauvoir and Kierkegaard and Plato and Aristotle to sort of emerge as also in our cloud of witnesses and our hiking partners.
And of course, if I were talking to an English major, they would have a list of poets that they would reflect on.
That's right.
I was taken by the story you told about your wedding and your wedding vows, in which in some way you must have written your own wedding vows, and that you agreed to walk together and talk together. Unpack that story for us.
Yeah, so my wife made the profound decision to marry a philosopher. And at the time, she made the ridiculous decision to marry a philosophy grad student. And what that means is I did not know how to say anything except through philosophical terminology. And so our deal was that she got to handle every single aspect of our wedding, but I got to handle all of the words that were said at it. And so I thought that was a pretty good deal. And in our vows, the end of them was, come, let's walk together and talk along the way. And that idea has always, for me, served as a kind of invitation, not only to philosophy, not only to purposeful living, but also to relational engagement. And I will say, the first draft of the wedding ceremony had a bunch of footnotes, and the pastor gave it back to me and said, I'm pretty sure this won't marry you. Try again. So it was several drafts that finally met with the approval, and she, for some reason, said yes to it. And so we've been walking and talking ever since.
And she likes to walk on the beach, and you like to walk on the mountain.
She does, yes. It's important to understand that when we talk about truth, and I think this is actually a social point, we tend to act like truth is something that divides us with rigid lines between. You either think X or not X. And part of what I'm hoping the book also does, and I try very hard not to let it be something that would turn someone off because of disagreements about social issues, but it requires that we be able to walk and talk, even if the conversation is one arguing for different views. And that's where the hospitality has to show up. And so, though she knows that I would always prefer to be in the mountains, I often walk on the beach with her. And though she knows that the beach, she thinks the beach is always the better place to go, she has, I admit, slept on the ground quite a few nights, but always with very thick air mattresses. So it's been glamping when she goes with me. There is no backpacking happening for her.
So how do your students respond to this? Do they get engaged with Kierkegaard? Are they interested in the camping and the hiking part of it? Do you take your students camping and hiking?
I do. So this next weekend, in fact, we're reading a book written by another philosopher named John Kaag, and he wrote a book called Hiking with Nietzsche. And so we're reading that book currently, and this weekend we're all going to go hiking together. And when we read Camping with Kierkegaard at the end of the semester, we're actually going to have a campfire and cover the book while sitting around a campfire together. I will say the thing that they respond to, and this is also something that was sort of latent in my awareness and then showed up in the book. Many years ago, probably 8-9 years ago, I realized that my classes were not full of first-year students potentially becoming philosophy majors. What was happening is I was getting all juniors and seniors who had been told by a friend, oh, you've got to go take one of his classes or check out philosophy. And so they were coming into this with no interest in doing it to do more philosophy. They were coming in to try to figure out how can studying philosophy help them in their lives.
Which is the purpose of the book.
That's the purpose of the book. And so I wrote this book, again, in some ways, to be, if a student wanted to know everything I thought philosophy invited them into and why it matters, I think this is maybe a good place to start. I will say the response from students has been great, but it's also coupled with questions about, so how do I then do this? How do I become faithful? How do I know if this is the right way forward? And I keep trying to explain to them, the book does not answer the question, what's worthy of your finitude. It's trying to suggest that if you ask this question and then strive towards faithfulness toward whatever does bring joy, whatever does allow for purpose in your life, that maybe that question can be answered because of your action. They live in a world where they want someone else to answer it for them so that their decision goes away. And the problem with that, and this is my definition of faith, it's not a religious concept for me, though it's fine for people to cash it out that way in their own lives. Faith for me is simply the notion of risk plus direction. And so the idea that life is risky because we are vulnerable, and any decision we make shuts down other options we could have taken. And that's hard. And so for students, they want that not to be true, so they want others to make their decisions. They don't have to wrestle with the consequences. But then the direction, every choice we make, puts us further forward in some direction. So if we own the risk and move on purpose, for me, that's in fact the most we can hope for in life, but it's a pretty good life if that's what we're doing.
I'll say it's a pretty good book, too.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yes, it inspired me. I'm not sure I'm ready to do all that you do, the way you described, especially the biking part of it.
There's a lot of injuries described in the book as well. So the vulnerability there might be lips that get sewn up and shoulders that get put in slings and ribs that have to heal, and there's certainly some of that as well. Yeah.
Yes, I certainly got that feel as I was reading through your own personal experiences here, because biking can be as tough as reading philosophy and understanding philosophy.
And ultimately, it's a metaphor. I mean, that's the
metaphor.
point.
Yeah. Thank you for being back in the meeting house with me today.
It's been my pleasure.
Dr.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate your time.
And thank you very much.
Absolutely.
We've been talking. We've been talking with full professor of philosophy at Furman University, Dr. J. Aaron Simmons, about his new book, Camping with Kierkegaard. Good luck to you.
Thank
I
you
hope
so
it
much.
stays up there in the top 10 or at the top of the list.
We'll do our best. I hope your audience picks up a copy, and please reach out to me if there's anything I can do for them. I'm always available. Would love to hear from you.
I'm going to do my part
appreciate
trying to promote your book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Good luck to
Appreciate
you.